July 1, 1916. At dawn along the Somme River, 750,000 Allied soldiers, British and French, wait for the whistle to signal attack on a front 25 miles long. For a week, their artillery has pounded the German lines. Commanders are convinced almost no one could have survived. On the other side, in trenches and bunkers dug over months, about 300,000 German soldiers wait in silence. They have spent a week under a bombardment that has hurled more than 1 million shells, but thanks to underground shelters, many units remain intact. At 7:30, the British climb from the trenches, advancing at a walk, loaded with full kit. Within a few hours, 58,000 men are hit. Nearly 20,000 die. It is the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and the front has moved a few dozen yards. For the Germans, that July 1 seems a defensive victory. Yet in the months that follow, the Somme will devour them all. One German officer will call it the grave of our army. How do you lose 1 million men for a handful of miles of mud? At the end of 1915, the Somme was not conceived as a British battle. It was an idea of the French High Command. At Chantilly, General Joffre proposed an offensive in this sector, where the British and French forces met and railways allowed men and guns to be massed. Their plan called for 40 French divisions, roughly 500,000 men, with a more limited British contribution. Then, in February, Verdun exploded. The French divisions promised for the Somme fell from 40 to 5, and in the attack, first scheduled for August, was brought forward to July to ease pressure on the Meuse. Suddenly, the Somme became the trial of strength for the British Army. The British Expeditionary Force was commanded by General Douglas Haig, a cavalry officer convinced that only a great offensive could break the deadlock. The assault on the Somme would be launched by General Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army, which had to employ the new volunteer formations, Kitchener's New Armies. Here, the British Army was unrecognizable compared with 1914. Before the war, it numbered about 250,000 professionals and 6 infantry divisions designed for colonial wars. By 1916, thanks to the new armies, more than 1 million soldiers were in France, organized into dozens of divisions. Volunteers often recruited in groups from the same town, factory, or neighborhood. They had uniforms and rifles, but little combat experience. On the other side, the sector was held by Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria's army group and, on the ground, by General Fritz von Bellow's Second Army. Over the years, the Germans had turned that rural zone into a deep defense. Trench lines, concrete bunkers, yard-thick belts of wire, and machine gun nests with fields of fire already registered. They knew the attack would come. The idea was simple. Every yard of ground had to be paid for dearly. From June 24, 1916, for 7 days running, the 25 miles of front line on the Somme had turned into a furnace of fire. The Allies unleashed a bombardment that, at its peak, reached 3 rounds a second. More than 1,000 guns hurled over 1 million shells at the German positions. The stated goal was simple and illusory at the same time: to cut the wire, smash the trenches, and bury the machine guns in their nests. But British artillery had 2 serious problems. Many rounds were still shrapnel, shells that burst in the air, throwing a cloud of lead balls designed to cut down men in the open. This kind of ammunition belonged to wars before 1914, when enemies advanced across open fields. Against deep belts of wire and concrete bunkers, it was almost useless. On top of that, up to 1/3 of the shells were duds that failed to explode or went off badly, leaving wire and shelters intact. The Germans noticed. In some places, They mocked the British with little boards offering to hand back the unexploded ammunition. Meanwhile, under the surface, another war was being fought. Royal Engineer tunnelers had driven at least 17 galleries beneath the German lines. In one of them, at Lochnagar, they packed 26 tons of explosive, enough to lift an entire hill. To Allied headquarters, after such a week and with mines of that power, no one could possibly have survived in the German trenches. In the concrete bunkers beyond no man's land, thousands of German infantry waited for the bombardment to end.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
At dawn on July 1, after 7 days of fire, an unnatural silence settles for a few minutes over the Somme front. Then, just before 0 hour, the ground erupts again. Beneath several German positions, the great mines laid by British sappers blow. At Lochnagar, 26 tons of explosive tear open a crater about 300 feet across and more than 65 feet deep. It is the signal. Among Allied headquarters, many are convinced that after such a bombardment and mines of that power, there can be no living enemy left ahead. At 7:30, along roughly 25 miles of front, 13 British divisions and 5 French divisions received the order to leave their trenches. In many sectors, British units advance in line, at walking pace, carrying 55 to 65 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, rations. The distances to cover run from about 400 yards to more than a mile. To run would be suicidal. They would arrive exhausted. So officers order them to advance in good order, convinced they will find only ruins. Reality is different. In many places, the wire is almost intact, and German machine gunners have returned to their position within minutes of the barrage lifting. When the dark figures of the British rise from no man's land, Maxim guns and other German machine guns open fire along already registered lines. In some zones, the first waves are cut down within minutes. By day's end, the British Army has about 58,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 are dead. Medical reports will say that only about 39% of the fallen were killed by rifle and machine gun bullets, while nearly 60% died under heavy artillery, often without ever coming within range of a German trench. Entire PALS battalions, men from the same town, the same factory, the same football club, are destroyed in a single morning. On the southern part of the front, however, the picture is different. Here, 5 French divisions attack, backed by more heavy artillery and with more limited objectives. In some sectors, they advance a mile or more, taking villages and several trench lines. They also suffer several thousand casualties on the first day, but far fewer than the British. For the Germans, overall, July 1 is a grim defensive victory, even though they themselves suffered about 10,000 dead, wounded, and missing. The line holds, the strength of their positions is confirmed, and at the same time it becomes clear that in a war like this, holding the front means turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse for everyone. In the days after July 1, neither army stops. The British realize the clean breakthrough has failed, and the Somme turns into a series of local attacks, village by village. La Boisselle, Contalmaison, Mametz, Fricourt. Each advance costs hundreds, sometimes thousands of men for a few hundred yards of ruined fields and trenches. Between late July and August, 2 places were carved into the memory of British troops: Pozières and Deville Wood. At Pozières, on the ridge overlooking the road to Bapaume, 3 Australian divisions take turns. Within a few weeks, Under constant shelling and German counterattacks, the Australians suffer about 23,000 casualties, almost as many as they had lost at Gallipoli in 8 months. The village and crest are taken, lost, and retaken in a spiral of blows and counterblows that grinds down men on both sides. A little farther east, in Delville Wood, a South African brigade receives the order to hold at all costs. About 3,000 go in. Only a few hundred will come out alive. For the Germans, too, the wood becomes a slaughterhouse. Assaults and counter-assaults cost them several thousand casualties in a few weeks. The wood is pulverized and renamed Devil's Wood. Overall, between July and August, German losses along the Somme sector rise to tens of thousands of men, comparable to British casualties over the same period. For the High Command in Berlin, it becomes clear that defense means more than companies erased, veteran non-commissioned officers lost, and divisions stripped from other fronts, even from Verdun, to plug the gaps and to keep the line intact. September 1916. After 2 months of attrition, Haig looks for a way to unlock the Somme with something other than yet another infantry wave. On September 15, in the Flers-Courcelette sector, he brings a new weapon into action for the first time, the tank. He had wanted 150 of them ready by July 1. In September, he receives 49. Many break down before reaching the start line. Others bog in the mud. In the end, only about 20 move forward with the infantry. These are Mark I machines, steel boxes crawling at 3 to 4 miles an hour, armed with 57mm guns or only machine guns in the lighter versions. For the British, they are still prototypes, full of flaws. For German infantrymen who suddenly see them looming out of smoke, crushing the wire and appearing above the trenches, they are a shock. In some sectors, frontline companies panic and pull back at a run. Yet the picture remains limited. Many tanks are stopped by artillery or by their own mechanics. Flers falls. The British advance a couple of miles, but the front does not collapse. Overhead, meanwhile, the Royal Flying Corps and the German Air Service confront one another with hundreds of aircraft. Reconnaissance planes correcting artillery fire, fighters dueling a few dozen feet above the ground. Here, too, the Allies gain local superiority, but nothing decisive. Tanks and airplanes show the future of war, but on the Somme in 1916, the present is still made above all of artillery, trenches, and mutual attrition. October brings rain and cold. The ground on the Somme, already pitted with craters, turns into a swamp. Tanks bog down, horses sink, and infantry slog forward in mud up to their knees. In spite of everything, the attacks continue. In mid-November, between the 13th and the 18th, the British attempt one last big push, the Battle of Ancre. Fifth Army finally takes villages such as Beaumont-Hamel, helped by the 51st Highland Division, and pushes forward a few miles. They pay with tens of thousands of casualties in a few weeks. The Germans, defending and then abandoning those positions, suffer a comparable number. By the end of November, after about 140 days of fighting, the Allied front has advanced only about 6 miles. No German collapse, no decisive victory, only 2 exhausted armies planted in the mud. Together with Verdun, the Somme pushed the war onto a scale of losses no earlier generation had seen. In about 4.5 months, the British lost around 420,000 men, of whom more than 120,000 were killed. The French lost about 200,000. German casualties ran between 450,000 and 500,000, a figure similar to, if not greater than, that of the Allies. In all, roughly 1 million soldiers were put out of action to move the front line about 6 miles. For Britain, the Somme was a national shock. The PALS battalions were cut down. Whole neighborhoods and towns lost in a few days. A generation of men. Yet it was also the baptism of fire for the new armies. From a small colonial force, the British Army became a mass army, able to sustain a long war of attrition. For Germany, the Somme was even more significant. One officer would call it the grave of our army. Entire divisions were consumed. Experienced NCOs and officers fell by the thousand, and reserves no longer sufficed. From then on, Berlin knew it could not win an endless war of attrition. Behind the lines, millions of shells were turned out in factories, often by women who had entered war industry in great numbers. Verdun and the Somme together were the most brutal demonstration of what trench warfare on the Western Front meant. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any episodes. In the comments, tell us what struck you most. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It's the simplest way to support this project.